Howdy folks, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am your host, The Mighty Bjorn, and today for you folks, I have a brand new Robotech video. Going to be taking some time today, and I'm going to be discussing the Grand Cannon. And, well, essentially, the Grand Cannon kind of has some interesting history. Let's just begin with the crash of the SDF-1. Because essentially the crash of the SDF-1 pretty much surprised the world and ended the global civil war that was going on at the time, which I've discussed in a previous video. And engineers would essentially begin working on essentially decoding the technology within the SDF-1 and essentially go through the process of actually repairing the SDF-1 and making it operational again. And they would also reverse engineer a lot of the technology from the SDF-1, which would actually give us both Project Valkyrie and Project Excalibur. Also covered those in previous videos. But it would also give Earth forces reflex cannon technology. And essentially that's where the Grand Cannon comes into play, because essentially they took the reflex cannons of the SDF-1, the main gun, if you will, and essentially supersized it and basically turned the Earth into a sort of pseudo Death Star. Which I guess on paper sounds like a pretty cool idea. They actually built the Grand Cannon at a secret base in Alaska, and actually the Grand Cannon itself and everything was actually underground, if you will. And the idea of the Grand Cannon is when the alien fleet would show up, the Grand Cannon would be powerful enough to defeat the enemy fleet. That's at least if they had hostile intentions. And, well, we know that the Zentradi fleet would show up, they would come a-knocking, and essentially they would end up chasing the SDF-1 from Pluto all the way back to Earth. We essentially know the events of the Macross saga, and once the SDF-1 would return to Earth, Doza's fleet would actually show up itself, and yeah, they would launch an attack against Earth, basically wiping out about 70% of Earth's population and pretty much leave everything in ruin. Now, the military personnel at the Alaska base would actually fire the Grand Cannon, kind of a last-ditch effort, if you will, and it did give the SDF-1 a bit of a fighting chance. With that being said, though, at the end of the day, it would only get to fire one shot, and basically the Grand Cannon would be destroyed and pretty much abandoned, at least until the MVID arrived, several years later, and they essentially, the MVID would actually turn the Grand Cannon and Alaska base into a Genesis pit. So one thing I really want to focus on discussing here is, was the Grand Cannon a failure? And I would argue, yes, absolutely it was, and, well, no, it wasn't. Let's start with the no, because that's actually a really short answer. And essentially that is, well, it fired, it destroyed a lot of Zentradi ships, and it actually gave the SDF-1 a fighting chance. It actually did, well, it didn't really even the playing field, but it evened the playing field quite a bit more, and it gave essentially the allied Zentradi and the SDF-1 a fighting chance to fend off the invading Zentradi from Doza's fleet. But now we're going to get to the yes side of things. And, well, I'm going to start with the fact that, well, the Grand Cannon was a very costly project, which is one reason why the project was abandoned at the end of the day. When the war was over, it was decided, do we rebuild the Grand Cannon or take the funds and use it for other things? And essentially the funds was used for other things, primarily rebuilding, including building new ships. The biggest flaw, too, with the Grand Cannon was the recharge time. It took a long time for that gun, the Grand Cannon, to charge and fire. Took a few minutes actually, and it took several minutes after it initially fired for it to be able to fire again. The next problem too was the limited fire arc. I mean, yeah, it had a bit of a fire arc, but yeah, it was still pretty limited. Now, it can be argued that there's a bit of a fog of war in this scenario here. It's not like humanity had any idea of how many ships the Zentradi had, or even that the Zentradi was ever going to come at all. But my argument is honestly, the resources it took for them to build a single Grand Cannon, they probably could have took and built several smaller reflex cannons that may have even been turret mounted, and it would have actually been more effective because basically that's just more guns facing space, which is where the enemy is going to come from. And now, folks, before people get rampant and raving in the comments down below about, well, there was supposed to be more than one Grand Cannon. Yes, I know. Actually, that I'm aware of, there was one Grand Cannon that was actually built. There was another Grand Cannon that was in the process of being built, which never got finished because, well, this is Zentradi. And there was a third Grand Cannon that was supposed to be built. The ground was supposed to be broken in the whole 9 yards, but it just never happened. So essentially, it comes down to, at the end of the day, only one Grand Cannon was ever built, and Earth was always on some type of bubble, because sooner or later, the Zentradi was going to come a-knocking and causing problems for Earth defense forces. Either way, that's just my thoughts about the Grand Cannon, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. Maybe it's something you might want to look into. Maybe you could even use it for your Robotech campaign. But anyway, folks, I'm going to wrap up today's video at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed it. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourselves a wonderful day.